Welcome to Authors in the Tent, where stories as vast as armies and small enough to fit in your pocket take center stage. Today with me in the tent is Quan Nguyen. Quan has been described as a mighty warrior, a magician, many wonderful things. But he's also the author of the stunning, best-selling memoir, Sparrow in the Razor Wire, Finding Freedom from Within While Serving Time. I had the honor of serving on a panel with Quan, and I have not been able to stop thinking about him and his story since. Quan did serve time for murder. Quan was paroled from a life sentence in 2015 and created his first company 6 months later. The following year, he received the Peace Fellowship Award for his work with the Alternatives to Violence Project, and he's been featured in Entrepreneur, PBS NewsHour, talks at Google, and numerous other publications and podcasts. I am so honored to have you here with me in the tent, Quan. Welcome.
Thank you.
I heard your drive down here was a nightmare.
Yeah, I think I outsmarted myself. I wanted to go, let me take toll road because maybe the main freeway is gonna not have traffic, and then suddenly on the toll road there was a big major accident and it stopped both sides.
COVID is loosening up, people want to get out, and of course they're coming to San Diego where they thought it would be warm, and instead it's cloudy and overcast and cold.
Yeah.
But that's May gray, June gloom, whatever. I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, when did you know you were a writer?
I've always loved reading, and I think I was first recognized for writing in 3rd grade. They sent me to the Young Authors Conference. This is when I grew up in Provo, Utah. They sent me to what's called a Young Authors Conference. I was already being recognized for writing.
In 3rd grade?
Yeah, in 3rd grade.
And so you moved from Vietnam when you were very young to Provo, Utah, and you lived there
about 10 years.
10 years, and then you moved from there
to California.
To California in Orange County. And in reading your incredible memoir, what I got out of it was that books played a large role in your life, always. And that you felt, I think books helped you because you felt like you were an outsider in each of those environments.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes. In Utah, I felt like I was an outsider. I mean, when my father got diagnosed with leukemia, I think books helped me to escape and maybe even stoke my imagination of, I used to love reading fantasy books, and I used to imagine myself, I wish I was one of these knights that could find a magic potion to save my father. And so they helped my imagination, I guess, to help escape with some things.
Your father's leukemia played a pivotal role in, I think, at least from what I gathered, well, your life in all respects, but also your move to gang life.
Yes.
Because you felt a great deal of responsibility for his diagnosis and his death, even though you really didn't, there's nothing you could have done, but you felt responsible for it. And that, coupled with your feeling of an outsider, I think led you in some way to gang life. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly accurate. I mean, I just felt like, I felt let down because, my father passes on, and each time he was going in and out of the hospital, I felt, my father, I'm not worthy of getting these prayers granted. Like somehow I'm not a good kid, or somehow I have nothing coming from the world. And it's just little things like that, and I'm sure it's funny because now I held on to a lot of different events, always to focus on the negative things. I never focused on things that were good. Like growing up in Provo, Utah, I would say now looking back, the vast majority of people treated me well over there and treated me lovingly, but somehow I only remembered the incidents of people that were, incidents of racism and things like that, and I just used that to color my belief in the world.
And you did have incidents of racism. So even in Orange County, you've experienced racism, even though there was a significant Vietnamese population there, but you still experienced that.
Yeah, I think just growing up in Provo, Utah, I became very attuned, or maybe very I would say, hypersensitive to anything that I viewed as racism, or maybe I don't even know at the time if I viewed it as racism. I think I viewed it as more like I don't fit in and people don't like me for some reason. And later on, I could latch on. Well, they're just racist, and like Hispanic kids, white kids, black kids, and even other Vietnamese kids that told me like I don't fit in, or they tell me you're whitewashed because I couldn't speak Vietnamese well. And of course, even looking back now, like I said, it's the vast majority of the other Vietnamese kids treated me well, but it's just a few of the ones that didn't, and I used that as, okay, this is more evidence of something wrong with me.
So it's a combination then of the actual bigotry that was there and your own sensitivities to those issues, because I can relate to this being a Jewish woman growing up in Whittier, which was a very Protestant area, and there was anti-Semitism, but I was also hyper aware of the anti-Semitism, and it colored a lot of what my experience of the world. Mm-hmm. So I totally get that. So the other thing that's I found really interesting in this book is your description of this kind of dual existence that you had. As you got older, you were going to college, and you worked for Gallup, right? And at the same time, you're a gang member, right? And so you had this kind of dual existence. When I think of dual existence, I think of being a Jewish American or a Vietnamese American, or, I think of it in terms of ethnicity. Mm-hmm. But with you, this was like a major, behavioral difference. Here you're this kind of
identity difference.
Identity difference. Mm-hmm. You're like on this very kind of straight and narrow path, and then this other path. And what actually brought you to shift more toward the other path, the path of the gang?
The path of the gang, I think, was a lot easier to self-identify. Like the path of being an accomplished student, somebody that can make my mom proud, somebody that can make my father, who passed on, proud, like just so the world outside could look at me as somebody accomplished. But I wasn't doing well in school. I didn't feel smart. So, it's funny because my family always looked at it and they tell the stories now, oh yeah, you had straight A's. And I go, well, I didn't have straight A's. I had good grades, but I didn't have straight A's. But it's just the narratives that other family members saw me and how I saw myself, it didn't really match up. But then in the gang life, I felt accomplished, I felt recognized, and I knew how to get recognition in it by just doing violent acts or being involved with violent acts. And it was, when I look back now, it's a very shallow way for me to live, but it was easier. Let's say if I can't express my dreams of, wanting to go to West Point and saying that for the first time in high school and having the kids laugh at me. So I never wanted to express that again, and I just held on to that. So whereas in the gang life, I don't have to aspire too much. I don't have to talk about dreams because I'm living in the moment.
Did you want to go to West Point at one?
Yeah, I wanted to go West Point. So my father was in the military academy in Vietnam. So when we came to the United States and he created the Vietnamese Refugee Association, he was pretty recognized for it in the Provo, Utah community. So there were quite a bit of politicians that would come to our home. So they knew my father was in the military academy. They knew he was had a military background. So I think they compared that to, okay, well, you can be the very first Vietnamese American to go to West Point. Do you want to be just like your father? And what little boy doesn't? So I remember reading books on West Point, looking at the gray uniforms, imagining myself like, okay, I'm going to be a hero like my father. And that was just always something I held on to. So even after his death, I want to go to West Point. It was something that I held on to, but when the first time, I think it was my freshman year, when kids were laying out all their goals or where they want to go, and the first time I said West Point, the other kids laughed at me. No way you could ever make to West Point. Who can write? And my father had passed away, so by the time, I think my junior year, I just felt like, I couldn't admit it to myself, but I go, man, I don't think I can make it. Like, I don't have the good grades. I don't have a politician to write a letter of recommendation on my behalf. So I remember I filled out for the ROTC. I filled that out at school, and it's a card. So I guess one of the recruiters called my home, and my mom picked up the phone, and she said, like, what? No, my son's not going to ROTC, and just hung up the phone and asked, like, why are they calling? And I couldn't say, I'm not making it to West Point, but I still want to try to redeem myself in the military some way, I guess. And that was my only path out. But even in that, I couldn't express myself to my mom. So I think just suppression of an identity that, or trying to attain an identity that I aspired to, but I couldn't make, and I was afraid of the failure of it. So it's easier in just the gang life where, hey, this is where I could be recognized. I feel like I fit in. I feel like I can be accomplished in some way. I'm still chasing this sense of recognition over here. But
when was the shift, or when did the violence begin for you?
Well, I think my first instance of violence already happened as a little boy when my brother and I were playing in the ditches in Provo, Utah. I think I was 8 and he was 6 or right around there, and some older kids and some adults were throwing rocks down at us in the streams and telling us, like, get out of our country, go home, you don't belong here. And my brother and I remember thinking, oh, that fence is so high, these kids are too far away. We said, make us. And I didn't believe how quickly they jumped the fence and started chasing us. So we ran, and I think I dropped some of my G.I. Joes. My younger brother turned to face them, and they punched him, and he fell down and began like throwing dirt in his mouth, and I just stood there. I didn't do anything. So I remember going home and my father finding out and said, like, how did you let this happen to your brother? Like, this is your family. You have to protect them. And I just felt like I let him down. Like, I felt so ashamed around it. And, of course, my father never spoke about it again. My brother didn't speak about it, and I'm sure because everyone forgot about it. But in my mind, I felt like I let them down. I cannot let this happen. So I remember the first time that I hurt another kid in the playground was probably a few months after. That's the first time I saw blood. And this kid, we were playing, I can't remember what happened, but the kid somehow said that my family eats grasshoppers. And I just went crazy on this kid. And that's when the first time, like, we were fighting, but then I ended up getting on top and was able to bash his head into the concrete right there. And there was a lot of blood, and I saw that. So I would say, and it was like later on just that same pattern where anybody threatening me, or my brother, like I remember my younger brother would go into rages with anyone ever coming close or insulting me, and I think that's just how we ended up protecting each other. I think it's because of that incident where we just felt, okay, this is what happens, and I never wanted to face on that again. So it just became a pattern for me where this is how I know what to do in this instance, and this is how I guess fight off this fear of feeling ashamed again.
I mean, it's clear to me that in our discussion, what a pivotal role your father played in your life, both as a kind of something to aspire to, but also somebody who you wanted to impress or gain. You wanted him to have respect for you, and that seemed to be like a, kind of your narrative. And clearly something that has a great influence on your whole pattern of behavior. The book itself, and again, the memoir form, if this was the only form you thought about writing, did you ever consider fictionalizing your experience, or was this, and my answer, I think I can almost answer it, is probably no, but maybe you can clarify that. One of the things I love about your writing is how spare, clean, straightforward it is, but there are moments of beautiful lyricism mixed in with that. Your language is very direct, and one of the things that I remember talking about on the panel that you talked about was how saying the word murder was very important to you. Euphemisms wouldn't work, and I see that in your language, in the language that you use in your whole book. And your book is framed by, or each chapter begins with an experience at the parole board, which is very powerful, laying it out the way, the accuracy of what happened. So talk a little bit about some of that.
Okay, so being the bookworm, I mean, I loved reading a bunch of self-help books. And I think at first when I laid out the outline, it was almost written like a self-help book, like this is what you have to think, but then thinking back to when I was facilitating inside prison in groups, I noticed that the men were mostly I felt most effective and men were most impacted by me when I shared of my own challenges, shared of my own story. So it wasn't me up there, like I saw facilitators where they prescribed like, hey, this is what you need to do to change your life. This is how you do it. And that's why it didn't feel right. But then I go, wait, why am I going to write in this context? I think I'd rather just write the way I talk, how I would facilitate a group, and I'm just going to share. That's because through Scribe, they just said, just write your vomit draft, write how it works. So I noticed like there was two tenses. Sometimes it was in this tense of from my own vulnerabilities, and there was another one where it's more prescriptive. And every time I got to those parts, like later on during the editing part, I go, this is dry, I don't like it. And that's when I started noticing. The beginning of the chapters was the transcript. Those are actual transcripts from my parole hearing. So I didn't have that idea until about 30-40% of my story. And I kept on referring, because I brought the transcripts home with me, and I kept on referring back to my transcripts. And I go, wait, why don't I put these actual transcripts in? It's also a form of the truth. It's also a form of what I'm saying transparency and vulnerability and being authentic is. And let me just put this in here. And it actually helped to move the story along. Because one of the other things that I've always tried to practice, especially later on, once I would have to say I became a little bit more mindful in my thoughts and speaking, is let's just get right to the point instead of saying a whole bunch of stuff, and just be as concise. So that's the way I also like to write. I mean, I love like authors like Malcolm Gladwell, who writes very simple, and so there were certain authors that also influenced the way I wanted to communicate.
Are there other authors that you were also influenced by? Do you have
so many? I mean, like I guess it just depends on what type of writing. But let's say like if we're talking about poetic, beautiful writing, is Khalil Gibran. Of course, Malcolm Gladwell, I like his simplicity. C.S. Lewis, the way he speaks about the soul and just viewing the world in a beautiful way. So,
well, those are great examples.
Yeah.
You know, I would say that you're now one of my examples of great writing. And one of the things that I also loved when we were in the panel was your mention of the truth table. And if you could just describe a little bit, that has stuck with me ever since that moment. If you could just describe a little bit what that truth table is.
Yeah, the table of truth is, so inside prison, when I was facilitating groups, there was this thing where we did, it's called like Who's at Your Table? And it's an exercise like where you speak like who's at your table, who's influencing you to make these decisions that you're making. So that table of truth for me was just an extension of how I was writing. So I'm thinking, okay, who is the book written for? And my book was written for men that are doing long or lifetime sentences. The Scribe team actually got me very clear on who, like, okay, who's the avatar? Like, draw this person up. And my avatar was a spitting image of one of my old monkeys. I think at the time when I left, he had been incarcerated longer than I had been alive. He was stuck in a very dark place. His name was David. And even though he saw me get found suitable, even though he saw me help quite a few other men go to the parole board and were found suitable to go home, he was still terrified to share his transcript, to sit down, to disclose himself. So I go, this is the person I would like to touch with the way I write. Yeah. This is the way that I would like to share. And maybe he doesn't have to talk back with me. He could just read it, and maybe I'll drop some little seeds for him, and it's up to him to nurture and cultivate his own sense of personal responsibility and everything. So so that's the avatar. So then I go, okay, who am I placing at my table when I'm writing this chapter, and is this what I'm saying here relevant? So it's at the avatar David. I placed at the table the man that I shot and killed, Min Nguyen. I placed at the table my 8-year-old self, the little boy that I think where I became lost in a sense, and my father. So those are the 4 people that sat at the table. And when I came to a difficult place in my writing, or when I come back and like what's keeping me motivated, then it's the people at my table. They could, does this chapter have anything to do, or what am I saying here? This last 5 paragraphs, which I wrote, which I love this writing, and it's so beautiful. And then I go, wait, does this belong? Does this sit well with the people at this table? And sometimes the answer is no. I'm sorry, I have to cut this out. And that's how I went about it.
It's such a wonderful way of describing, no pun intended here, the idea of killing your darlings, right? Yeah. It's just a beautiful metaphor, and one that I've tried to incorporate into my own experience writing. Since we are in the tent, and the tent for me was this space of inspiration, where I was stymied inside. I came out and I noticed how important space had become to me. This was being in this kind of liminal, interstitial space, as somebody who I know a writer friend used that term and it fits. I'd like you to talk just a little bit about this, the space of the incarcerated space, and how that ironically freed you. It was this space where you were forced into, but that space actually became a kind of epiphanic space for you, correct?
Yeah. I think for years I just looked at, if I'm looking at this place as punishment, this is terrible, then I'm going to see all the things around me that are terrible and constricting. But I guess I would have to say, like, once I came to, it was like 10, 12 years into my prison sentence, and like a bunch of things were happening at the time. Like I of course, were reading a bunch of books, going down different rabbit trails of different authors, and sometimes I get fascinated with certain authors, so I look in the acknowledgments to see what other authors influenced them, and then go down those rabbit trails. And it was during that time when I somehow, going from one rabbit trail to another, stumbled on these books of the saints. And in particular, I was fascinated with stories of saints that had failed in their lives, but then had gone on to create legacies. And those stories really drew me in. Around the same time, I also got, I think is the first time I've seen a picture of my little niece. It's my brother's daughter. It's my younger brother's daughter. And I just saw, she looks exactly, this is my brother. And it just took me back to childhood. And I just began thinking, like, how did I end up here? Where did my life take me? Am I supposed to die in here? So I think, of course, reading the books on the saints takes me down other rabbit trails of, soul writings, like from C.S. Lewis and some of his books, and it just began freeing my mind of how to view my space and just my place in the world. And it was like one day in the prison yard when I just stood there at the fence, and my head filled with these writings. I had just meditated that morning. I just had that calm peace, and I stood there at the fence and I said, why does prison have to be punishment? Why can't this be a place where I can remake myself? And I realized I actually can. Like, I can make myself a better person. It's what's keeping me from it, and it was nothing. So I remember that the sun was coming up barely over the hills. I could feel its warmth, and in the little blades of grass I could see the individual drops of dew, and up above me in the razor wire, that's when I heard that sparrow chirping. And I tell everyone, it's probably been chirping my whole term, but I did not hear it. But from that day, that's when I heard it. I noticed it on the yard. I noticed, I hear them now, but and then it transformed prison from a place of punishment to a place where this is a time and a space for me to rebuild myself and to rebuild my world. And so, yes, in the midst of prison, I found my peace, I found my freedom, and this is years before I was even paroled from the life sentence.
Of course, I got chills when you talked again about the sparrow in the razor wire. That is just such an incredible image. If we can move on a little bit, and it's kind of related to the idea of who can write for whom. This pressing literary question today, the identity question of, is it possible for somebody with an identity that is not of the character or person they're writing about to write about that experience authentically? I'm a crime fiction writer, right? And so I write about murder. I write about murderers. I write about crime. I write about violent crime. But I haven't experienced it firsthand. And I'm wondering if you have read crime fiction, and what your feeling is about others representing an experience that is not their own, and if there is, some sort of disconnect or dangerous disconnect in representing or in glorifying or in, take some of the representations of serial killers that, while they are horrific, somehow idealize or romanticize, I would say, the behavior somewhat. So I'm just curious about where you stand as someone who is actually, you know, the real deal.
Well, I remember I used to read some books in prison, but some of the characters, and they're writing about like someone that committed murder or someone that was did violent acts. I think because for my mind, I could say, okay, this is fiction, or sometimes I'm reading, I could pick it apart. This doesn't feel real. So I think the better writers, I mean, it's not me to tell someone if they qualify to write or not. I mean, that's each person's story, but it's just, for myself, I just felt like, say, if I can be a voice for the people that are incarcerated, and that was just the way I wrote it. So I don't know. I mean, I think if I know what I'm reading, if this is fiction, or if somebody that's writing it and putting it as like, okay, this is an authentic story. Like even like Hollywood, when when they have these shows about people that are incarcerated, and I watched like some of these ones. That's not how our real experience is, and I think they come from an angle of sensationalizing, or they come from an angle of
yes.
Look at these violent animals in here, and I look at it like, no, these are like beautiful human beings that are incarcerated. So that's the way I wanted to write mine.
Sensationalizing was the term I was looking for. I said idealizing, romanticizing, but sensationalizing is actually the term.
Yeah, or even a form of like voyeurism, but it's not.
Yes,
yeah,
and there's such interest in crime fiction. I mean, it's people devour it, and you really wonder what that is. Is it a kind of living vicariously, not having to actually commit something, but living through, having some kind of window into the experience? But I think reading your book gives you a real window into the real experience in a way that crime fiction does not. I'd like to conclude our interview with my question about a hobby or a passion. I wanted to know what hobby or passion you have other than your writing that might be related to your writing and that you'd be willing to discuss with me.
Let me see, because I was going to tell you about the Table of Truth.
Well, that is,
I mean, that helped my writing.
Yes.
When there was that question, I was thinking about, okay, what helped me with my writing? Because when my father, I was first recognized for writing at 8 years old. And then when I came here to California, I was also recognized, and I went to the UCI Creative Writing School for writing. But after my father passed away, well, it wasn't until I was doing my life term in prison. I think the last few years before I paroled, I joined a creative writing group. And I remember we wrote, and I came back, the first time I read to the group, I was feeling so nervous, and it was so quiet. And as I'm reading it, well, what are people thinking? They're going to say something. And when I got done, I didn't dare to look up, and everyone was just looking at me like they're like, you write so well. And that was not what I thought they were going to say. So I thought, oh, and they just said like, how long have you been writing? And that's when I realized, I go, wait, I haven't written since 20-something years. The last time I wrote was when I was 12, and I thought, like, why did I stop? And I go, because my father died, and I think that's when I stopped writing for a long time. But what I think did help me to get very clear in my writing again once I started was the journaling process. Once the light came on for me, I journaled extensively. I wasn't writing creatively, but I was journaling, and I just pouring my thoughts, and I think that became a really good container for me to help me realize I can write, and it helped me realize like how it makes me feel when I write, where I can just pour my thoughts, my feelings, and just re-examine them and just see like how I guess I am at, or where I am at. And so then that helped me with creative writing, and I think that helped me begin like realizing, okay, I can write, and I am an author. And
so journaling was like a hobby that became a resource for your writing.
Because the journals, I mean, I sent the journals. I have like 5-6 journals that are this thick that I sent home of all my writings in prison. So I referenced them a lot when I was writing the book. I wanted to see where I was feeling, what was my mindset. So it was interesting to go back and read it and to see the progression of my, I would have to say, like my mind and how I saw the world and my place in it.
Yes.
And how I could begin to, I guess, slowly make impact and realize, oh man, I can affect change in this small way, and then it progresses. So yeah.
Are you working on something else?
Not yet. I mean, Yeah, I've been told I have to write more, and
Yeah,
the
you-
publishing team says, yeah, you let this stuff settle down. You have to write more, but I don't know what I'm going to write yet. I didn't know what I was going to write in this yet.
I think it will come.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quan, thank you so much for being here today. It was wonderful having you in the tent.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Quan Nguyen was our guest today in the tent. His book, Sparrow in the Razor Wire, about his years incarcerated and his transformation while in prison, is worth the read. Get it. Thank you.